Island of the Aunts, Chapter 2. By the time she was 10 years old, Minette had made the journey between London and Edinburgh 47 times. 47 station buffet sandwiches, 47 visits to the loo on the train, and 47 stomach aches because changing families always churned up her inside. Minette's father lived in Edinburgh in a tall grey house and was a professor of grammar. Minette's mother lived in a flat in London and was an actress. At least she would have been if anyone had given her any work. They had been separated since Minette was 3 years old, and they hated each other with a bitter and deadly hatred. "Tell that louse of a father of yours that he's late with his money again," was the sort of message that Minette's mother usually sent as she took her daughter to King's Cross to put her on the train to Edinburgh. Or, "No doubt your mother is still running a rooming house for drunken actors," her father would say as he fetched her from the train. Minette never gave her parents these messages. She made up polite, friendly messages for them to send to each other. But neither her mother nor her father believed her when she delivered them. And on the journey, which took 5 hours, Minette would look out the window searching for houses where she and her mother and her father would live together one day like an ordinary family, with a cat and a canary and a dog. For it went on hurting her, hurting and hurting. Not that her parents were separated. Lots of children she knew had separated parents. But they hated each other so much. On these journeys, Minette was usually put in the charge of an aunt. The aunt came from an office called Useful Aunts, and what she was like was important because if she talked all the time or wanted to play silly games, Minette couldn't give her mind to finding houses for her parents to live in or imagining beautiful scenes where she was run over and taken to the hospital and her mother and father rushed to her bedside and looked at each other over their daughter's bleeding body and found that they loved each other after all. Then, as she got up to go on her 48th journey, Minette suddenly realized that it didn't matter what kind of aunt they sent to take her because she had given up hope. Her parents would always hate each other, and she would spend the rest of her life traveling from London to Edinburgh and back again, never quite knowing which was her home or where she properly belonged. And as though someone up there had heard her, that day they sent her a quite extraordinary aunt. She was so unlike the other aunts she had traveled with that both Minette and her mother stopped dead as they came up to where she waited, by the bookstall on platform 1 of King's Cross Station. "Are you—" began Mrs. Danby. The woman nodded. She was very tall, with a small mustache, and carried a large hold-all that smelled slightly of fish. "I am your aunt," she said in a deep voice, and pointed to her lapel, on which there was a label saying, "Unusual Aunts," and above that the word, "My name is Etta." If Minette's mother hadn't been in a hurry to go to the cinema with her latest boyfriend, she might have asked more questions. After all, an unusual aunt is not quite the same as a useful one. But as it was, she handed over the money for the tickets and Minette's lunch, took the cigarette out of her mouth long enough to kiss her daughter, and went away. And presently Minette and the aunt sat opposite each other in one of those old-fashioned compartments that have no corridor, and watched the train make its way through the London suburbs. Aunt Etta and her sisters had had a hard week in London. They found a boarding house full of people like themselves, aunt-like persons who had come to town to show their pug dogs at dog shows or go to meetings about setting up retirement homes for ancient donkeys. But they hated the noise and the traffic and the dirty air, and they did not find it easy to get taken on by an agency. Even when Etta made up an agency and advertised for clients, the children she was given to care for were unspeakable. She took a little boy on a trip down the river who spent the whole time stuffing himself with ice cream and popcorn and crisps and dropping the wrappers in the water. She was sent to take a small girl to have her teeth cleaned and saw her bite the dentist's hand. And she sat with a whining brat called Tarquin Sterndale Fish, who had had the measles. So by the time she met Minette at King's Cross Station, Etta had begun to think that this kidnapping idea was pretty stupid. The world seemed to be full of boo-boos and little ones, and it was better to become extinct, like the rainforest, than to bring such children to the island. Her first sight of Minette did not make her feel hopeful. The child had a crumpled, pinched sort of look. She was small for her age and very thin, and looked as though she had been born tired. A meek and feeble child would be quiet, useless for work, and had to be done. She was also very stupidly dressed with a load of fluffy pom-poms in her long brown hair and a t-shirt that said, "Pinch me and I'll squeal," and a pink plastic handbag shaped like a heart that dangled from her shoulder. And if Aunt Etta did not like the look of Minette, Minette was not the least keen on Aunt Etta. For a while the two of them sat in silence, and from time to time a drop of water fell from the canvas hold-all that the aunt had put on the luggage rack onto her top knot of gray hair, but she didn't seem to notice it. "Is something leaking?" asked Minette. The aunt looked up and shook her head. "The canvas never seems to dry out properly. I use it to move seals about. Only pups, of course. A full-grown seal would never fit inside." Minette began to be interested. Her face lost its pinched and troubled look. "Are you a vet, then?" Not exactly, but that does sort of come into it." And then there was another silence. Minette did not like to pry, so she looked out the window again. They were coming to the first of the dream houses that Minette had chosen to live in with her parents. It was in an old station master's house with hanging baskets of flowers in a little gable. And as she thought, and as though she read her thoughts, the aunt said, "What a pleasant place to live in. There might be a ghost train going through at night with interesting specters. That could liven things up." Minette stared at her. "Do you believe in—" "Oh, of course," said the aunt briskly. "Certainly I believe in almost everything, don't you?" "My father says we mustn't believe anything we can't see or prove," she said. "Really?" When they had been traveling for an hour, Minette opened her suitcase and became very busy. She had been wearing pink and orange socks with a border of Mickey mice. Now she took them off and put on plain white ones. Then she removed the t-shirt that said "Pinch me and I'll squeal" and put on a navy blue one with long sleeves and no writing at all. And lastly she put on a dangling handbag back in the suitcase and took out a practical leather purse. The aunt said nothing, watching as Minette changed from a trendy little dresser to a sensible, old-fashioned schoolgirl. But Minette had not finished. She took out her brush and comb, propped a mirror on her knees, and began to fix her hair into 2 long, tight braids. "I always change here," she explained, "because there's nothing interesting to look at out the window. My father doesn't like clothes with writing, or funny socks. He says they're vulgar, and he hates untidy hair." "And when you come back, you change back again? Put on the pom-poms and unbraid your hair?" "Oh, yes, my mother likes it loose." "And you? What do you like?" Minette sighed. "I'd like it cut short." "Well, I have some scissors here. Why don't we just cut it?" She opened up a very large handbag and took out a pair of scissors. "Oh, no, I couldn't. Then both of them would be angry." Aunt Etta shrugged and dropped the scissors back into her bag. "Actually, long hair can be useful." Well, how can it? Oh, for polishing things, oyster shells and such like. And if you fell in the water, it would be something to get a hold of. They had come to the second of Minette's dream houses, a low white house on the bed of a river with a willow tree and a garden sloping down to the water. But this time Minette did not see her mother and father taking tea together on the lawn. She heard her father saying, "That willow must come down. It cuts off all the light." And her mother saying, "If you cut that tree down, I'll have you put into the mental home." And suddenly, for no reason, she told this strange woman about her endless journeys from her mother's tiny flat, with its smell of face powder and curry from the takeaway downstairs, and the tights dripping in the bathroom, to her father's cold, tidy, solemn house with its ticking grandfather clock, and about the silly dreams she'd had of bringing them together, and the hopelessness of it all. "Well, do you think there might be a third place? Not my father's house or my mother's apartment, but somewhere else, by the sea perhaps? And that one day I might find it?" She drew back, suddenly frightened, because the fierce aunt was looking at her far too intently. But Aunt Etta was nodding. "Of course," she said. "Of course there's a third place. There's one for everybody. But it's not no good filling it up with people from your old life. If you want to find the third place, you must find it alone." "But I'm a child. I can't go and live alone." "Perhaps not. Not exactly. But you might be able to make a new start just the same, if you had the courage." "Oh, I don't have courage," said Minette firmly. "I'm a coward." It was one of the few things on which her parents agreed. "I'm frightened of the dark, and of diving off the high board, and of being bullied." The train stopped at York, and the aunt bought sandwiches off a trolley. "Now I suggest you go and wash your hands and freshen up," she said, "because it's time we had our lunch. Which of these sandwiches would you like? Egg and cress, or cheese and tomato?" "Cheese and tomato, please." If Minette had known what was going to happen as soon as she had gone, she would have been very scared indeed. For out of the pocket of her long navy blue knickers, the aunt took out a little box with a brownish powder, which she sprinkled carefully into the center of the cheese and tomato sandwich. Then she unzipped the hold all and sat back in her seat with a very contented smile. "My first one," she murmured to herself. "My very first kidnapping. Oh, really, this is most exciting." And then, "Oh, I wonder how Coral is getting on." It had been much harder to get Coral to look like an agency aunt. She was the plump one who had been to art school, and when she was young, and she liked to stand out from the crowd, but she had done her best to look sensible. She wore only 2 necklaces and 1 pair of dangly earrings, and the hand-painted squiggles on her robe and matching turban were peaceful squiggles, so when she rang the bell of the big house in Mayfair, she felt that she looked as aunt-like as she ever would. This idea of fetching Hubert Henry Mountjoy from his grandparents' London house and taking him back to his boarding school in Berkshire made Aunt Coral feel extremely glum. Her first batch of children had been as bad as Etta's. A poisonous, pudgy child who had tried to kick her shins, and a little boy who jumped on a beetle in the park. She was sure that Herbert Henry Mountjoy would not be her cup of tea. A cold-eyed, snotty little artistrio too big for his boots, and she had decided that if she caught him jumping on beetles, she would wallop him hard and give up on being an aunt and go home. As she was shown into the Mountjoy's hall by a snooty maid, she felt worse than ever. The house was huge and dark and cold, and there were a big brass gong in the one corner, paintings of dead Mountjoys with handlebar mustaches hung on the walls. She waited with the deepest gloom for her first sight of Hubert Henry and his school uniform. The door of the drawing room opened and a small boy came out, pushed forward by a tall white-haired man who looked exactly like the men in the portraits, except that he wasn't dead, and her mouth dropped very slightly open. Hubert Henry was small and lightly built with jet black hair, olive skin, and huge, very dark eyes. Something about the graceful way he moved and the wary look on his face reminded her of pictures that she had seen of the children in South America who made their home among the vines and orchards and broad-leaved trees of the tropical forest. The old man with a handlebar mustache now spoke. "This is Hubert Henry," he said in a braying voice. "As you see, he's not a born English gentleman, but we mean to see that he becomes one. Eh, Hubert?" And as he dug the silent little boy in the ribs, Aunt Coral saw a look of such hatred pass over the child's face that she took a step backward and hit her backside on the big brass gong, at which point Hubert Henry threw back his head and laughed. An hour later they sat side by side in a large black car on the way to Hubert's school. The car was a limo, the kind you hire for weddings and funerals, with a glass partition sealing off the chauffeur. It was a 3-hour journey to Berkshire, but the driver had refused to take Hubert Henry by himself, so Aunt Coral was to deliver him to the Grey Marsh Towers and hand him over to the matron. The little boy, it had seen, had tried to jump from the train and run away the last time they took him back to his boarding school. "Are you really called Hubert Henry?" asked Aunt Coral as they began to leave London behind. "No. Well, what are you called?" "Fabio." He had a slight accent, Spanish perhaps, or Portuguese. She hoped he would say more, but he sat in silence and sulked. And then,